Hearts are pretty cool. Without them, we wouldn't exist. To some, a heart is just a physical organ that pumps blood around our bodies. To others, it represents something more. It's connected to someone's very being, their soul, who they are and how they show up in the world. The same could be said for tubes in a tube amp. To some people, the tube is just a bunch of metal inside a capsule of glass that moves electrons to amplify the music. Those who've spent time playing with different tubes in different tube amps will know that the tube is actually the heart and the soul of a tube amp. It's the heart of the amp in the practical sense of making the tube amp work, but it's also the soul in the more emotional sense of defining how that tube amp sounds and how the music that comes from that tube amp is able to stir our emotions. And so, should you spend more money on tubes for your tube amp? That's a complex question. And it obviously does include some elements of considering your financial position and your financial priorities, as well as the value of the amplifier itself and the other gear around it. And so instead of discussing whether you should spend more money on tubes for your tube amp, let's talk about why you might want to spend more money on them. In concept, every tube is the same. It's a series of metal components that pass electrons across a gap with a musical signal playing through it. And all of those components are held in a vacuum contained by a glass envelope. That's the concept. Just like all cars consist of a motor and a chassis and some wheels with some seats to carry passengers. We all know though that there's a big difference between a Ferrari and a Toyota Corolla. Likewise, there are some big differences between some tubes too. Let's start by looking at the recently released 12AT7 Select tube from Ray Tubes. Now for full disclosure, I am the Australian retailer for the Ray Tubes brand, and that's why I'm not approaching this video as a review of these tubes, so much as a general educational piece about tubes in general. You can decide at the end of this video what tubes you want to buy and who you want to buy them from. This tube is made in a factory that produces other tubes for other brands as well. Almost all tubes are. In fact, this tube is almost guaranteed to be produced on a production line that produces identical looking tubes for other brands. In other words, it's not just that they come out of the same factory, they probably come off exactly the same production line. When it comes to 12AT7 tubes, or indeed any tube of the same designation, they all have to have roughly the same specs to work consistently in an amplifier designed for this specific tube. If we continue the car analogy, it's a little bit like tyres. You can buy tyres from multiple brands that will have similar dimensions and specs. Things like the rim size they go on, the width of the tyre, the profile of the tyre, and even the speed rating. However, the rubber compounds, the steel bands inside the tyres, and the tread patterns can all combine to produce vast differences in the performance of the tyres and vast differences in price as well. It's exactly the same with tubes. The metals used within the tubes and the specific layout of those components within the tubes can be different from one brand to the next. And that can change how the tube performs and the sonic characteristics it produces. And then on top of that, if we think about the fact that these have come off the same production line as other brand tubes, there's also variation of the componentry inside the tubes. Not the design of them, but the quality and the specifications and tolerances to which they're performing. And that means that tube A from a certain batch and tube B from that same batch can perform very differently. And that leads us to talking about what you're actually paying for if you're buying a premium tube, and that's regardless of the brand. I'll speak here about what I know to be true in the selection process of tubes for the Ray Tubes Select range, and so there's no guarantee that all of what I'm about to say is true for every brand of tubes. But it should help to illustrate the differences between premium tubes and budget tubes from various brands. Firstly, all of the Ray tubes are run for 24 hours of burn-in before they're considered for full testing. That ensures that they're operating correctly and not failing, and it also allows the internal componentry to go through the cycle of heating and cooling to settle down anything that could have gone wrong in that process and to make sure they settle into their normal operating parameters. After that, they go through specific testing and inspection. I mentioned earlier that tubes are designed with a vacuum inside this glass envelope. If that vacuum isn't perfectly made, it can affect the sonic performance of the tube and its long-term reliability. In other words, small amounts of air getting into the tube where the pins come out of the tube could result in a change of the sonic performance of the tube and could make it fail early. That's why in the case of the Ray tubes, they're going through an actual microscopic inspection process to ensure that the casing around all of the componentry is perfectly sealed. If not, the tube goes back to the manufacturer, who's going to sell that tube to a different brand, maybe at a lower price, or who is going to sell it into a different application where perhaps it's not so important, because tubes can still be used in many different applications, not just audio. Now, even if a tube does have a perfect glass envelope containing that vacuum, it doesn't mean that they're all then going to be equal, and that brings us to electronic testing. Each tube is then tested for electronic factors like its internal resistance, its amplification factor, and the amount of current that it draws. Some of this is to guarantee the consistency of the performance of the tubes, but it's also to make sure that they meet the standards expected for the designation, in this case 12AT7. The other benefit of that is it allows the matching of tubes. And that's for those situations where you might have an amplifier that needs a pair or a quad, even an octet of tubes that all draw the same amount of current and therefore put out the same amount of output. And so all of that information is captured at the factory during testing, and it's secured in the case of the Ray tubes to the serial number attached to each tube. And that ensures that the tubes can then be matched up later on to sell to people that need matched pairs, matched quads, or even more. But if you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that measurements don't really tell the whole story when it comes to audio. There is a lot that we can measure, but there are also things that we don't know how to measure, things that we can't measure because it's beyond the tolerance levels of the analyzers, or things that we really don't understand what the measurements mean in terms of the auditory experience of listening to that device. And for that reason, the Ray tubes also have to pass listening tests before they're sold into the market. Those tests are going to ensure that there's no unwanted nuances to the sound that are going to make it sound different from other tubes in the same batch. On top of that, there's some physical stress testing to identify if a tube is overly microphonic. And what that's about is that some tubes will make a ringing or echoing sound when subject to any significant vibrations. For example, I noticed the other day that every time I typed on my keyboard, one of my tube-based devices here was producing an annoying ringing sound. It was like a rhythm in time with my typing. I swapped out the tubes in the device to a more premium set of tubes, and the sound went away. And if you've ever had a tube that's highly microphonic, you'll know exactly what I'm speaking about, and you'll know just how disruptive it can be. And so, after all that testing, a Ray tube in the Ray Tube Select range is ready for sale either as a single, a matched pair, a matched quad, or whatever it is that you need. And it's all that rigorous testing that ensures that any tube that you buy from a premium brand, in this case Ray Tube Select tubes as an example, it ensures that those tubes match the standards consistently that you expect from them. It means that you know that when you take these tubes out of the box and plug them into your amplifier, you're going to get an upgrade of sound from the stock tubes, and you're going to get a consistent sound if you then need to replace those tubes in the future with the same brand again. It's how you know you're going to get a tube that will last, that also has warranty for that matter, and is going to sound better than cheaper tubes that you could have bought that might have been more of a lucky dip. These tubes have been handpicked or even ear-picked to be certain that they're bringing you an upgraded sonic experience every single time. And that's the big difference for me between a premium tube and a cheaper tube. The cheaper tubes, you might get lucky and get a great one, or you might get unlucky and get one that's just mediocre. It's a choice that you get to make. But that's talking about the Select tubes. Let's talk now about the Ray Tubes Reserve tubes, because they look a bit different and they're more than just cherry-picked and tested versions of tubes that are available elsewhere. If you look at a reserve tube like the Ray Tubes 6SN7 Reserve or the Ray Tubes KT88 Reserve, you'll notice that it has this grey coating inside the tubes. I have a curious mind, and so I wanted to know what that was all about. What was it there for, and was it actually improving the sound? And so, here's what I learned. The grey coating inside a Ray Tubes Reserve tube is a layer of monocrystalline carbon. That's just a fancy way of saying that it's one big single lattice of carbon atoms laid around the inside of the glass. As you can imagine, it's pretty tricky to do. If you remember what I said earlier about tubes amplifying signals by passing electrons across a gap with the signal playing through it, because there are electrons floating around in space inside the tube, that layer of carbon is intended to prevent any stray electrons from gathering around the outside glass walls. What that does is ensure that all of the electrons contained within the tube are doing what they're intended to do and amplifying the signal. In other words, none of them are bouncing around creating noise in the signal. They're all working towards the common goal of making your sound louder and therefore making it cleaner and clearer because there's no extra noise. As always, having less noise in a signal means a more focused sound, a cleaner sound, better imaging, better staging, better resolution, or at least that's the theory, and we'll test that in just a moment. But something else that layer of carbon is intended to do is to block out outside noise as well. It's going to prevent electromagnetic radiation, things like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, radio stations pumping out their music, anything that's floating around in the environment from getting into your tube and mucking up your sound. Once again, the benefit is intended to be less noise, and therefore a more pure, focused and defined sound. And then the final thing that coating does is help to dissipate the heat. That's going to keep the tube operating within its optimal temperature range, which will both improve its performance, but also extend the life of the tube too. And so it looks like that coating is there to do a lot of good stuff. But at this point, you might be thinking that that's a very expensive coating, and does it really do enough to justify the price difference? If that's the only difference between an $80 KT88 Select tube and a $200 KT88 Reserve tube, is it worth the difference? Thankfully, there's a bit more to the Reserve tube than just the carbon coating. Let's talk cars again for a moment. Just like a Ferrari might be built with premium materials and design approaches, like using carbon fibre and monocoque chassis to make it lighter and more aerodynamic, a Reserve tube uses different materials and designs on the inside too. I don't have the details of exactly what's being done inside the Reserve tubes that's different, and to be honest, it's probably beyond me anyway because I don't understand tubes to that level of detail. But the purpose of using the better materials and designs is twofold. Firstly, better materials and design approaches can deliver better sound quality, but equally as importantly, it will also deliver longer lifespan for the tubes. And that's very important if you're making a significant investment like you are with something like a Ray-Tube's Reserve tube. This is all really nice in theory, but that's all we've talked about so far is theory. Let's put it to the test. Running the Elekit 2U8200R speaker amp and headphone amp with the 12AU7 Select tubes from Ray Tubes in the preamp sockets, and either the KT88 Select or KT88 Reserve tubes in the power tube sockets, revealed the truth. I was listening both with speakers and also the Final Audio D8000 headphones. That review's coming soon, subscribe if you're interested. But listening with both speakers and headphones, the sound with the Select tubes was smooth and clean. There was a good separation of the sounds, and the tonal balance I would describe as being quite natural, quite neutral, but maybe a little bit smoother than what is truly accurate. There was good detail and resolution, but that setup was not about to beat some of my similarly priced solid-state gear on technicalities, detail retrieval, resolution, etc. Swapping out to the Reserve tubes required a bit of a delay while I waited for the Select tubes to cool down, plugged in the Reserve tubes, and waited for them to warm up. That delay was going to make it difficult to spot subtle differences. Only the differences were so significant, I didn't have to worry. I could have tested these two tube types on different days and I still would have known the exact differences. Moving up to the Reserve tubes with their premium internal materials and design and the external carbon coating delivered significantly more separation of sounds and a much wider soundstage. The resolution and clarity from the amp was also scaled up significantly, and altogether that produces a greater sense of dynamics, rhythm and energy from the amp. Tonally, you can hear that these are related, but the Reserve version of the KT8 tube is just the most pure and transparent version of that sound that I can imagine. It's clean, it's detailed, it's resolving and exciting, but it still has that expected tube character. It's natural, it's organic, and it's enjoyable. And so for me, it's a very easy equation. If you're in a position where you have a tube amp that can take the Ray Tubes Reserve tubes, and you've got the budget and the willingness to spend that money on those tubes, it's a guaranteed upgrade. But that brings us back to the question at the beginning of whether or not you should spend the extra money to upgrade the tubes in your amp. And that's still a decision that you need to make. On a practical level, I can tell you that the Ray Tubes are very well made, they're very well packaged and presented, both in terms of their boxes, but also things like the quality of the screen printing on the tubes, that's all great, and they come with a 12-month warranty for peace of mind. On a subjective level, I can tell you that the Reserve tubes are a significant step up in terms of the sonic enjoyment they deliver. That's even in cheaper amplifiers. But from there, the best recommendation that I can make is to look for other reviews, look for the discussions on forums about these tubes to help you make up your mind from other sources that don't have skin in the game like I do. And on that note, if you've tried the Ray Tubes for yourself, let us know in the comments down below what was the amp you used it with, which Ray Tube did you try, Select, Reserve, etc., and what were your experiences with the tube. Perhaps even more helpful is what other tubes have you tried alongside them and what did you prefer and why. Of course, if you already know that the Ray tubes are right for you, I've put some links in the description where you can jump through and buy them from a whole range of different distributors now. They're not just available in Australia and the US and Canada, they're now available in Europe as well, I believe. The links are in the description where you can go and find out more. But if you're not quite ready for that and you want to dive deeper into understanding more about tubes, I've also recently reviewed the Pavane Horizon range. These are a more affordable range of tubes from Pavane, and you can watch this video here for some comparisons between the Pavanes and other tubes from brands like JJ and even the Ray Select tubes. So check that one out if you want to dive a bit deeper before you make your decisions, or use the links in the description if you're ready to buy something now. And for now, thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you that leave super thanks on YouTube videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.